So next up in this human environment system, the word itself has system in it, and we discussed system before as connected components. Each component doesn't function necessarily independently by itself or doesn't do much that is complete, but when it is part of the system does something as a whole that each component cannot do. So I am here talking with my digestive system, my neural system, skeletal system, and so on, and talking to you. This is a system that we are talking about, as we discussed before. So in this system we also want to do causal loop modeling, because you have the most important and typical characteristic of a system are internal feedbacks. There are dependencies, of course. If to move my hand and to speak, I have to get the brain to tell me something, and the brain has to have food for it to function, and I have to breathe the cardiovascular system, and so on and so forth. Basic building blocks for constructing functional models in human environment systems are, again, elements and dependencies. However, this time the elements are variables that can change, and the dependencies between elements are directional and can be either positive or negative. These dependencies cause a change in one element to spread to associated elements, creating a branching chain of causal relations through which any impact on the system could propagate to distant parts of it. Again, you can think of the human body. If I'm speaking now and I'm getting tired, then my brain will tell me you better take some rest and get a cup of coffee or something. So there are internal feedbacks which are directional. I cannot tell the brain to sleep. The brain tells me when it's tired and when I should take a nap, but brain will tell me that you are getting tired, so you should stop talking, for example. Okay, I'm just giving some simple example. So these can propagate through the system. The propagation of a change between each pair of elements may be immediate or delayed to various degrees, making the time for analysis critical, since the time scale before the appearance of adverse effects is essential when linking risk to sustainable development. So you can again think of human body, smoking or drinking or working beyond your sleep time, and there may be a delayed response even though the brain has already told you that you are tired and you are not functioning well, you should get to sleep. Or if you are smoking, you may well be aware that it's not good for you, but there may be a delay in terms of the response in actually stopping. But there are of course details as to why smokers smoke and why they have a hard time quitting, and so on and so forth. So systems are always complicated. So the delays, often indicated by two parallel lines crossing the dependence in a causal loop diagram, as we'll see in a minute, are also significant contributors to the complexity of the system. So if you have feedback, and if it's a two-way feedback, then it can be positive or negative. Positive feedbacks are typically are feedbacks that can create instabilities, or the initial perturbation can get amplified and can lead to system failure, whereas negative feedbacks damp the initial perturbation, the system stabilizes again. You can think of the thermostat as a simple example of negative feedback, where you set the heating or cooling to a certain temperature. If temperature falls below, then cooling will kick in, the cooling will turn off, or the heating will kick in. If the temperature goes above the threshold, then the cooling will kick in or the heating will go off, and so on and so forth, right? So you understand the negative feedbacks. Positive feedbacks, of course, you can think of as a mother and a child. A child begins to get cranky because the child is not getting the toy or not being allowed to play. Mother says this is not the time to play. The kid begins to scream. Mother gets angrier, snatches the toy away, and the kid gets even angrier, and so on and so forth. These delays, often indicated by two parallel lines crossing the dependencies in a causal loop diagrams, are also significant contributors to the complexity of the system. Remember from chapter 9 that not only the number of elements determines the complexity, but also dependencies between them, leading to what Senge refers to as a dynamic complexity by separating cause and effect in both space and time. So by the time the perturbation may have propagated through the system, system and created another set of feedbacks, you may not even know where the original trouble started. So some perturbation may have propagated into the system through some elements, and the feedbacks then may have completely become disengaged from the cause, and the effects may look completely unrelated in space and time to the original perturbation or the cause. So causal loop modeling in that sense has to track and understand what the actual cause is. Okay, so here looking at the delays and so on, a causal loop of elements, directional dependencies and delays. So you have element here sitting and depending on something like omega, it is a negative dependency in the sense that if omega increases, then element goes in one direction, which is towards stabilizing, let's say, or damping, and if omega decreases, then it goes the other way. So this is like a thermostat, if you will, and with the delay this will feed to another element, so that will then have a positive effect on the next element, which will then hit A with another positive element. Then with a delay, this signal comes back to the element. So the original dependency may be negative, but then you have created a positive on this side. In general, in such a feedback loop, you would multiply all the feedbacks, and this has one negative feedback and 4 positive feedbacks, so the multiplication is a negative quantity, which means this is a stable loop. That's in a very simple sense, but as we just said, networks or causal loops can be very complicated. For example, warming causes humidity to increase, humidity increase causes, let's say, extreme rainfall causes negative impacts on forests, and forest negative impact can have increasing effect on warming, and warming will again increase humidity. So you can have complicated feedbacks in a real life loop when you do this. Okay, so let's jump to systems archetypes, and we'll look at some more types of feedback loops. When constructing qualitative models using causal loop modeling, for which the output is a more or less complex system of causal loops, it is sometimes possible to identify systems archetypes. A systems archetype is a pattern of behavior of a system based on a set of elements and dependencies in a functional model, which can be found in various contexts and thus generalized and used to analyze systems behavior more generally. Examples of relevant systems archetypes are fixes that fail, eroding goals, escalation, success to the successful, limits to success, shifting the burden, growth and underinvestment, and tragedy of the commons. So we'll look at these as examples, but just try to read up and find other examples which are more realistic. Tragedy of the commons, limit to success, shifting the burden, eroding the goals, and so on are realistic situations. These system archetypes are all conceptualized slightly differently in various literature. In a fixes that fail situation, an apparent problem symptoms calls for attention. A solution is implemented that alleviates the symptom but has unintended consequences that, after a delay, cause the original problem symptom to return or even worsen. In response to this, more of the same solution is applied, allowing a reinforcing loop to perpetuate or even aggravate the problems. We'll see in a minute. Getting out of the fixes that fail situation usually entails acknowledging that the applied solution only relieves the symptom and committing the identifying the underlying okay, let's make sure the sentence reads correctly. Getting out of a fixes that fails situation usually entails acknowledging that the applied solution only relieves the symptom and committing to identifying the underlying problem. So it delays or it prevents the identification of the underlying problem, because you look at the symptom, you fix it, and it comes back, you fix it again, and so on. Then combining the original solution to ease the symptom with a fundamental solution to the real problem helps ensure that we do not get stuck in an endless cycle of solving our past solutions. So this is obviously talking about more complex human systems where we are using energy. Energy is greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions cause warming, and warming causes heat waves. Then we use ACs. ACs use more energy, and we go into this loop. So fixes that fail, when warming happens, the quickest adaptation is buying an air conditioner, but that's not a real solution, because that only exacerbates global warming unless we find a way to make air conditioners completely carbon neutral, right? So fixes that fail, you have a problem and you have a fix, but that fix has some unintended consequence with a delay potentially, and that comes back and provides a positive feedback for the problem, in the sense the symptoms come back with worsening effects, and the fix itself has a quick negative impact on the problem that the symptoms are alleviated. When you have eroding goals, again, you have a desired state you want, and you want to fill the gap to make sure that you are getting to the desired state. So you have pressure to adjust to the desired state, which should have beneficial effect or negative feedback to the desired state, but the gap may lead to activities to improve the state. With the delay, it may actually improve the actual state and make the gap worse, let's say. Okay, so you have two loops here where the eroding goals are struggling between the desired state and the pressure you feel to adjust the desired state to manage the gaps, but then you have activities to improve the state which are actually not helping the overall reduction of gaps, so you end up eroding the goals. You have sometimes escalation. I'm being a little bit light in explaining these, but you can go and read the book for more text, but I think I'm conveying the main points anyways, so please read the book if you want more details. So here you have X's position relative to Y's, so you are facing a threat to some A, which is a negative signal here, which then leads to action taken by X, which then results the result of the X's action is a positive feedback, and that affects X's position in a positive way, but that is related to that is a negative impact relative to Y's position, which then increases the threat to Y. Action will be taken by Y, which again alleviates Y's condition or position, but then that has another impact, unintended consequence on X's position. So these are kind of complex archetypes where you have escalation happening, where you have multiple stakeholders or multiple players or multiple organizations, multiple countries, and so on, where one is trying to adjust or reach their preferred state, which is not necessarily the preferred state of the other player, other organization, other country, and so on and so forth. This happens very commonly when you are sharing rivers, for example. Upstream community can take all the water they want, but they exacerbate the condition for the community downstream, and then you have battles that escalate the situation. Okay, so this is growth and underinvestment and tragedy of the common system archetypes. So success to the successful is where you have success of X based on action of X to corner resources, ends up being negative impact on resources for Y, and then that action to reach success for Y ends up being contrary to the success of Y. In other words, here it's the power with domination. We talked about this before, where we talked about power as domination and authority and legitimacy and so on. So in this success to the successful, you have the dominant one, or the upstream water user in a river, benefiting without any help for the downstream users, for example. Limits to success, so you have performance in the middle for efforts that affect this in one way, and the action may be actually constrained, let's say externally. So if you want to share the river appropriately, and the constraint is the amount of rain or the reduction of rain that's going on, then the farm production for both of them, or fisheries for both of them,
or drinking water for both of them may be limited, and there will be limits to success. I'm just being a little idealistic, but you understand what I'm saying. So shifting the burden, again, you will have side effects, which then creates problem symptom treatment, leading to symptomatic solution and not solving the problem. So fundamental problem fundamental problem remains, and side effects from the symptomatic solution keep feeding to the fundamental solution itself, making it worse. So you just shift the burden from problem symptom to actually fundamental solution itself. Okay, so I don't know, I hope it makes sense. Here, growth and underinvestment and tragedy of the commons. You understand how these work. Tragedy of the commons, which was the word used by Hardin in the 1960s, and he used the idea of a pasture being shared by a bunch of sheep grazers, and there was no limit set to how many sheep each each farmer can buy. They keep on buying sheeps, and eventually nobody has enough pasture land. And this is the problem of open source or open access resource, not necessarily tragedy of the common, but tragedy of the common is where there are multiple players who are using the resource without worrying about what the total activity of X and Y will be on the resources available and where the resource limits come from. So you may be starting in a very good high rainfall epoch, or in a very low population epoch, let's say for Colorado River, but then Arizona grows, Phoenix grows, and number of the population along the river grows, and soon rainfall drops because of global warming, and then you have a huge tragedy of the commons, because the agreements made are very old and based on a time when the resource limits were very different, and now you are imposing newer resource limits and so on. Okay, so underinvestment again happens because you have perceived need for investment in capacity, and you have performance, and demand and growth are trying to balance each other, and the perceived performance need is adding to the perceived need to invest capacity, which demands investment, but then capacity may come with a delay and not affect the performance as much as you want to meet the demand, but growth may become another external constraint that basically limits the growth in terms of underinvestment, because here there is no limitation other than investment. That investment itself is not keeping up in terms of increasing the capacity and so on and so forth. So this is a bit long, but we'll come back and wrap this additional material from the second edition of the book with agent-based modeling. Okay, see you in the next podcast.